There is a particular kind of horror that hides behind a mild face. Sidney Gottlieb, chemist, poet, goat farmer, folk dancer, devoted husband, spent more than 2 decades as the United States government's principal expert on how to break, bend, and control the human mind. In Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control, journalist and historian Stephen Kinzer reconstructs the life of a man most Americans have never heard of, and through him the story of MK-ULTRA, the CIA's sprawling and secret campaign to weaponize psychiatry, pharmacology, and torture during the darkest anxieties of the Cold War. This is a summary of that book, its argument, its evidence, and what it asks us to remember. Kinzer's thesis is direct. Gottlieb was not a rogue operator, but the trusted instrument of the highest levels of American intelligence, and the programs he ran represent one of the most systematic assaults on human dignity ever conducted by a democratic government against its own principles. The book is a work of recovery. Gottlieb burned nearly all the records before he retired, and the official investigations that followed never grasped what he had actually done. Kinzer pieces the story back together from surviving documents, depositions, interviews, and the testimony of victims and their families. What emerges is both a biography and an indictment of one man and of the institutions that armed him. This is a summary and commentary intended to teach the book's ideas, not to reproduce them. What follows walks through Kinzer's account from beginning to end. Chapter 1. I Needed More of a Challenge. The book opens not with a villain, but with a retiree. Kinzer introduces Gottlieb in his final years, a man living in a woodland eco-lodge, meditating, writing poetry, raising goats, caring for the dying and the disabled. He had a clubfoot and a stammer, was rejected from military service, and channeled a restless intelligence into chemistry. Kinzer's opening move is deliberate and unsettling. He wants the reader to sit with the gap between the gentle, seeking man and the work he did. Gottlieb was, by the accounts of those who knew him, kind, curious, and spiritually hungry. He was also the man who oversaw the dosing of unwitting human beings with mind-altering drugs, the commissioning of torture research, and the manufacture of poisons meant to kill foreign leaders. The chapter establishes the central puzzle the whole book circles. How does a person hold both of these things in one life? The narrator lets that question stand without cheap resolution, because the answer is not that Gottlieb was a monster in disguise. He was a whole man who did monstrous things while believing he served his country. That is far more disturbing and far more instructive than any cartoon of evil. Chapter 2. Dirty Business. To understand MK-ULTRA, Kinzer argues, one must first understand what flowed into it. He takes the reader to the rubble of post-war Germany, where American intelligence officers were quietly recruiting Nazi scientists and absorbing the fruits of their human experimentation. Through Operation Paperclip and its shadows, the knowledge gained in concentration camps and Japanese biological warfare units did not vanish with the defeat of the Axis. It was inherited. Kinzer traces how figures who had conducted lethal experiments on prisoners were shielded, employed, and consulted. The chapter's argument is that the moral firewall Americans imagine between themselves and their enemies was, in this domain, deliberately breached. The men who built America's chemical and mind control programs studied at the feet of those who had already crossed every line. This inheritance is the hidden foundation beneath everything that follows, and it should trouble anyone who assumes that a nation's stated ideals automatically govern its secret conduct. Chapter 3. Willing and Unwilling Subjects. Here Kinzer turns to the discovery that would obsess Gottlieb. LSD. He recounts the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann's accidental encounter with the drug's staggering effects and the growing conviction within the CIA that this compound might be the long-sought key to interrogation, to breaking prisoners, to controlling behavior. The Cold War terror that drove this search was real. American officials believed, wrongly but sincerely, that communist powers had mastered brainwashing and that the United States was falling behind in a race for the human mind. Gottlieb was handed the mandate to close that gap by any means. The chapter marks the point where curiosity curdles into transgression, where the line between research subject and victim begins to dissolve. Chapter 4. The Secret That Was Going to Unlock the Universe. Gottlieb reports for his first day at the CIA on Friday the 13th of July, 1951. Kinzer presents this as the true beginning of the story. The moment a talented chemist is given nearly unlimited money, secrecy, and moral latitude to pursue the fantasy of chemical mind control. The narrator conveys the intoxicating quality of the mission as its architects experienced it. The belief that they stood on the edge of unlocking the deepest secret of human consciousness, and that whoever unlocked it first would hold the ultimate weapon. This is where the book's larger warning takes shape. When brilliant people are granted power without limit, cloaked in secrecy, and convinced that the stakes justify anything, the guardrails that protect the human person do not merely weaken. They are treated as obstacles to be engineered away. Chapter 5. Abolishing Consciousness. Kinzer introduces George Hunter White, the hard-living narcotics agent Gottlieb hired to run safe houses where unsuspecting people were dosed with LSD and observed. In a Greenwich Village apartment, ordinary New Yorkers who had made the wrong acquaintance were given drug-laced drinks and monitored as they came apart. The goal was to see what LSD did to people who had no idea they had been drugged. The chapter is a study in how easily human beings become instruments once they have been reclassified as data. The victims here were chosen precisely because they were marginal, people unlikely to complain, unlikely to be believed, unlikely to matter to anyone in power. That selection is not incidental. It reveals the moral logic of the entire enterprise. Some persons were treated as expendable in the service of a supposedly greater good, and the willingness to make that trade is the first and deepest corruption. Chapter 6. Any effort to tamper with this project, MK-ULTRA, is not permitted. The program acquires its name and its structure. Kinzer details how MK-ULTRA metastasized into scores of sub-projects funneled through universities, hospitals, prisons, and research foundations, often using front organizations so the money could not be traced to the CIA. Respected institutions took the funding. Prominent scientists lent their credibility. The chapter shows how a secret program corrupts far beyond its own walls, drawing the machinery of legitimate science into experiments no ethics board would ever approve. The title's warning that this project must never be tampered with captures the impenetrable secrecy Gottlieb built around his work, a secrecy that would later let him erase almost all of it. Chapter 7. Fell or Jumped. This is the book's most famous and most wrenching episode, the death of Frank Olson, an army biochemist who was secretly dosed with LSD by Gottlieb's team at a retreat, and who, days later, went out a New York hotel window to his death. Kinzer lays out the official story of a troubled man's suicide and the mounting evidence that the truth was darker and deliberately buried. The Olson case became, decades later, a symbol of the program's human cost and the government's willingness to lie to a grieving family for a generation. The narrator treats Olson not as a data point, but as a person destroyed, a husband and father whose life was taken by his own government and then obscured. The chapter's power lies in its refusal to let the machinery of denial have the last word. Chapter 8. Operation Midnight Climax. Kinzer describes one of the program's most grotesque operations. CIA-run brothels in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes lured men who were then dosed with LSD and observed through one-way mirrors while agents watched, sometimes with a drink in hand. The banality of the arrangement, expense accounts, safe house decor, casual cruelty, is the point. What had begun as a search for a defensive weapon had become a routine of drugging strangers for observation, funded by taxpayers, hidden from every check that a free society is supposed to maintain. The chapter shows how transgression, once normalized, becomes administrative. Evil here does not announce itself, it files reports. Chapter 9. The Divine Mushroom. The story widens to the CIA's interest in naturally occurring psychedelics and the broader cultural currents Gottlieb's work would inadvertently unleash. Kinzer also traces the political backdrop, the rare voices in Congress, like Senator Mike Mansfield, who sought oversight of an agency that answered to almost no one. The chapter underscores a theme that runs through the whole book. An institution operating in total secrecy, accountable to no one it could not persuade or intimidate, will pursue its own logic to places no citizen would sanction. The absence of oversight was not a bug. It was the condition that made everything else possible. Chapter 10. Health Alteration Committee. Kinzer turns to the other half of Gottlieb's portfolio, assassination. Gottlieb personally prepared poisons intended to kill foreign leaders, including Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, and devised the tools of covert killing: poisoned handkerchiefs, toothpaste, dart guns. The bureaucratic euphemism of the chapter's title says everything. Murder had been given a committee and a clinical name. The narrator draws out the moral inversion at the heart of this. A government founded on the conviction that persons possess inviolable dignity had built an office to extinguish inconvenient lives with chemical ingenuity. The techniques were sophisticated, the morality was primitive. Chapter 11. We must always remember to thank the CIA. The great irony arrives. After years and fortunes spent, Gottlieb concluded that LSD was too unpredictable to serve as a reliable truth serum or control agent. But the drug had already escaped the laboratory. Through the program's own careless diffusion, LSD leaked into American society and helped ignite the counterculture of the 1960s. Kinzer relishes the paradox. The agency that sought to use the drug as a weapon of control instead helped loose a chemical that would fuel a rebellion against authority itself. The chapter is a lesson in unintended consequences, the way that power exercised in secret, convinced of its own control, so often produces exactly what it feared. Chapter 12. Let this die with us. As Gottlieb rose in the agency's ranks, he also began to prepare his exit. Kinzer describes the man's rich private life alongside his growing determination that his work should never be fully known. The chapter foreshadows the destruction to come and deepens the portrait of a man who could compartmentalize with terrifying completeness. Meditating by his pool in the morning, overseeing the infrastructure of drugging and killing by day. The narrator does not resolve this contradiction cheaply. It is the human capacity for compartmentalized conscience, more than any external evil, that the book asks us to fear in ourselves. Chapter 13. Some of our people were out of control in those days. The reckoning begins. In 1973, anticipating scrutiny, Gottlieb ordered the destruction of the MK-ULTRA records. Kinzer shows how this single act of erasure succeeded almost completely, ensuring that the full truth could never be assembled. The chapter's title, drawn from an insider's rueful admission, captures the belated and self-serving way the agency would characterize what had been not a few people out of control, but a sustained, sanctioned program. The destruction of the records is itself a moral act, a final refusal of accountability that compounded every earlier wrong. Chapter 14. I feel victimized. Investigations finally arrive. The Church Committee holds its hearings. Journalists dig. A Freedom of Information Act request by researcher John Marks unearths surviving financial records that the shredding had missed. Yet Kinzer shows how thoroughly the truth eluded even these efforts. Senators focused on assassination plots and domestic spying and never grasped what MK-ULTRA had been. And Gottlieb, called to account, presented himself as the aggrieved party, a patriot hounded for having served. The narrator lets the chapter's title land with quiet irony. The man who oversaw the victimization of so many had come to see himself as the victim. Chapter 15. If Gottlieb is found guilty, it would be a real first. The legal aftermath. Victims and their families sought justice through the courts, and Kinzer follows their long, mostly frustrated efforts to hold Gottlieb and the government responsible. Immunity, secrecy, destroyed evidence, and the passage of time protected him. The chapter is a sober meditation on the limits of legal accountability when the state shields its own. Justice in the fullest sense was never done. The narrator does not pretend otherwise, and the honesty of that refusal is part of the book's integrity. Chapter 16. You never can know what he was. The book closes as it opened, with the enigma of the man. Kinzer surveys the wreckage, the dead, the damaged, the lives quietly ruined, and returns to Gottlieb's final years of apparent gentleness and service. He offers no tidy verdict because none is honest. Gottlieb died in 1999, still largely unknown, taking most of the truth with him. The narrator leaves the reader with the deepest question the book poses. What does it mean that a man capable of such cruelty could also be, in the ordinary texture of his days, so recognizably human? The answer the book quietly points toward is that the capacity for great evil does not require a monster. It requires an ordinary soul that has accepted that some human beings may be treated as means, that secrecy excuses what daylight would forbid, and that the ends of power can sanctify any technique. Taken as a whole, Poisoner in Chief establishes something that ought to reshape how a reader thinks about power. It is not a story about a uniquely evil man or a uniquely evil agency. It is a story about what happens when human beings are granted secrecy, resources, and a mission urgent enough to silence conscience, and when the inviolable dignity of the individual person is quietly reclassified as negotiable. Every victim in this book was someone made in the image of something higher than the state, and everyone was treated as raw material. The horror of MK-ULTRA is not finally that it was exotic. It is that its logic, the marginal person as expendable, the secret as license, the greater good as solvent for every restraint, is always available to any institution that stops believing certain lines cannot be crossed. Kinzer has written a warning as much as a history. The mind control fantasy failed, but the willingness that produced it did not die with Sidney Gottlieb. This has been a summary of Stephen Kinzer's Poisoner in Chief. It is a remarkable, disturbing, and important book, reported with care and told with restraint, and it rewards reading in full. Seek out the complete work. The detail, the documentation, and the human faces Kinzer restores to this buried history deserve far more than any summary can give.